Hi everyone, welcome to our first live Q&A at MoMA. My name is Corey D'Augustine, and we're going to be taking live questions and answers for the next 20 or 30 minutes here together. The way this is going to work is that as you type in questions, our producers will give me a couple. But as we have a couple questions lined up already from previous videos and from the Coursera course, why don't we jump right to it? First question comes from Phil Twalinski, and Phil asks, who is this guy? He really knows his stuff. Thanks, Phil. Well, just a couple sentences about myself. I'm an art conservator or restorer. I work on 20th and 21st century paintings, sculptures. I did that here at MoMA for about 5 years. I have my own studio now. I've taught at MoMA for 6 or 8 years, and I teach art history at a couple of different universities here in New York City, as well as online in the Coursera course that many of you know about. Next question from PS Griga, nice name. Do you let the previous layers dry before applying a new layer? This one comes from YouTube and the Mark Rothko video. Sometimes. Rothko often would paint a dry, opaque layer underneath as kind of the ground coat, the base colors of his work, before doing a lot of glazing over them. And again, sometimes glazing with a lot of medium, actually more often staining with a lot of solvent. Sometimes those individual stains and glazes in the upper layers would be painted wet in wet, in other words, not letting the undercoat dry. But many times he would work wet over dry. He would change his paints at times, working with a lot of different additives. So Rothko, a great technician of paint. So again, the answer, sometimes yes, sometimes no. Next one from Our Tiempo, also on YouTube, also from the Mark Rothko video. I read that besides the turpentine burn method, Rothko used additional additives to his paints. Do you know what any of these were and the effects they created? As a matter of fact, that's a great question. It's a topic of current research because Rothko, almost in a way like Leonardo da Vinci, is someone who very willingly deviated from the understood and the canonized methods, techniques, recipes for how to make a stable painting. He didn't care so much about that as much as he did achieving very specific aesthetic effects. So he used very traditional things like linseed oil, also like egg tempera going all the way back to the Middle Ages. He would mix egg into his oil sometimes, rather unorthodox. That's a technique called tempera grassa, at least in the Italian Renaissance. He also worked with animal glues. He worked with acrylic resins, especially later on in his career. He worked with a paint called Magna. That was the first acrylic paint that Morris Louis and other color field painters worked with extensively. So again, sorry not to be ultra specific here, but Rothko is someone who painted in so many different ways with so many different materials. But as you're starting to explore his paintings, looking at them really closely, very much like a de Kooning, you're going to find some very interesting, odd appearances of paint. And as you start working in the studio, trying to emulate some of them or finding your own ways through them, feel free to experiment quite wildly and widely. If it doesn't stick, if it cracks upon drying, make a note of what you did and probably skip that one next time. But certainly we have some great artists who have experimented very radically away from traditional materials and techniques. Next one comes from de Kooning on YouTube. This is Ellie Denise, who asks, can you use olive oil on the oil color to make it flow? Smiley face. Well, smiley face for me too. Not olive oil, but we do know that de Kooning actually made great use of safflower oil. That's kind of frying oil for your French fries, something like that. In paintings, especially in the 1970s. There's a great painting in the Guggenheim, the Solomon R. Guggenheim's collection here in New York City called Whose Name Was Writ in Water. It's a 1975 canvas. It's a huge canvas. One of de Kooning's great paintings from the 70s. And there's, believe it or not, you can Google this and find an image of it, but kind of a juicy cherry red drip that is still dripping, believe it or not. The painting is 40 years old, and because in that specific location, there's a lot of that likely safflower oil and not so much drying oil like linseed, it's still wet, literally. So every couple of years, if you look at the painting again, it's going to be another half a centimeter, full centimeter down the painting. It's kind of this ultimate elegy to the great action painter Willem de Kooning, the drip that keeps on dripping. Let's see, what do we got? Alberto Arredondo from YouTube. I work in egg and oil tempera, as we were just talking about, and I've read that a few months after the paint cures, you can seal it with acrylic gel medium after it dries. Could you continue painting with acrylic? Yeah, the answer here is yes. Well, as a rule of thumb, the fewer things that you combine together, the simpler you keep it, the more structurally sound your painting is going to be. In other words, if you start with oil, keep painting with oil, chances are it's going to be a strong painting from a physical standpoint anyway. Same thing, you start with acrylic, keep on painting with acrylic, great. Now there are certain materials that combine quite nicely, like egg and oil, for example. That works pretty well. Starting off in egg and oil, sealing it with acrylic gel medium, continue painting with acrylic, I wouldn't go that route. Because you're working with natural materials like egg and drying oils, linseed oils, as a rule of thumb, I would stick on the natural side of the fence rather than shifting to synthetic resins like acrylics or PVAs, polyvinyl acetates. If I were working in that style, I'd work with Damar varnish rather than that acrylic gel medium sealant. Damar is a typical traditional varnish. It comes from trees. It's a natural resin that's going to bind more strongly with the natural resins, egg, linseed oil that you applied underneath it. So whereas that acrylic approach that Alberto mentions here, it might be okay. In the long term, I would worry about that starting to peel or delaminate off or lead to some cracking. It may work, but I think it's a stronger solution to work with natural resins like Damar or mastic. Another live question here. This one comes from Boycott. Uh-oh, hope you're not boycotting me. Can you mix oil and acrylic paint together? Related question here. Yes and no. De Kooning, as you may know, did a whole lot of things that you're not supposed to do, like, for example, mix safflower or water into his oils. Mixing oil and acrylic paint together, just try it, and you're going to know already that you have some really uncomfortable adversaries in your paint working. It's not going to flow together nicely. It's going to get lumpy and chunky, and even if you have a whisk and you try to blend this up, it's going to be rather frothy and unhappy looking. As you paint with it, it's going to change on the surface of a painting. It's going to settle out in a weird way as those layers start to repel and separate from each other. But the ultimate, answer to that question is sure, if you want to. There really are no hard and fast rules for contemporary painters to follow. The real name of the game here is weighing what's important to you. If it's really important to you to make a very structurally sound, durable painting, then you probably don't want to go that route. If that weird, frothy, uncomfortable looking texture is really what you're after, then by all means, if that's what does it, then put your hands, or put your faith in the hands of conservators like myself. I've had a couple younger artists tell me with a straight face, I consider my work to be a collaboration with conservators. Okay, that keeps me in business, I like that. But we're pretty far away from, the times of the guilds and the academies when, to be a good painter, part of that meant making a painting that lasts for a long time. We're not necessarily in that moment here in the 21st century. Next one comes from YouTube, how to paint like Yayoi Kusama, the Japanese artist who's still working. In fact, she has a retrospective at the Hirshhorn in DC right now. Sandy Lambert asks, is there a reason that in your demonstration of creating a Kusama painting, you chose to work with oil over acrylic rather than just sticking with acrylic paint for the white application? Fair question. Kusama certainly made some paintings all in acrylic. She also made a lot of paintings all in oil. For this kind of painting, for me personally, I prefer the aesthetics, the feel, the look of oil. So if I had more time, I would have worked oil over oil. But as we were cranking out these paintings in a single day, I didn't want to work in an oil underlayer because clearly that wouldn't dry in the same afternoon. And then I'd be working wet in wet with a top coat, which would pick up some of the black base layer. That was really just a method of expediency. But certainly you could work acrylic over acrylic, oil over acrylic, or oil over oil. The thing you probably don't want to do is work acrylic over oil, because again, we have that tendency to delaminate between layers as that painting might age. Next one also from YouTube, from actually the announcement for today's Q&A. Joe Soonthorn Sawad asks, I'd love to see a demo on Alberto Buri's combusted plastic pieces, or more realistically, a demo on glazes and gels. Okay, those are rather disparate topics here. But Alberto Burri, the Italian post-war painter, a great artist, and an artist who has a lot to do with a lot of the artists that we are focusing in, both on the YouTube videos and in the Coursera course. Burri actually was an early friend of Robert Rauschenberg, and they kind of traded ideas. Rauschenberg has a retrospective just opening tonight, as a matter of fact, here at MoMA. I would love to do that. That sounds like a lot of fun to me. Part two of that question, demo on glazes and gels. Yeah, we've actually had a couple questions about this. Glazing, it's a bit hard to wrap your mind around it originally, but as you really start to get a couple of key fundamental ideas down, it's really not that difficult. And then once you understand this with your hands, you start going to museums like MoMA, or like the Metropolitan, probably even better, and you can really understand how some of these paintings, the deep, luminous paintings, are made. So yeah, I hope we can do that. Let's go to another live question from Lily Haskell. Which artist has been the most difficult for you to study, /understand, /emulate with painting? That's an excellent question. One of the things I'm working on right now is thinking about how to emulate a Picasso blue period painting for a totally different project, but maybe we'll make a video out of that as well. Anytime you're painting with Picasso, tread lightly. Picasso, although he made great efforts to paint clumsily at certain times in his career, don't be fooled, Picasso absolutely had the greatest hand of any painter, any draftsman in the 20th century. So I'm a little scared on that one for sure. Difficult to study and understand. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if I can name a specific artist. These artists who are working in very signature styles and handling materials very uniquely, specifically, like an Ad Reinhardt, like a Mark Rothko, who we were just talking about. These artists are really challenging because you need to start from the ground up. Things that you think you know about paint really well may not apply to these artists, even though they're using the same materials, but they're using them in very unique ways or combined in different ways, etc. Whereas working with paintings after the academic period, for me, gets way more interesting because there's so much more variety. Especially as a conservator, it gets a little bit daunting and a little bit intimidating as it gets difficult. Artist by artist rather than school by school or century by century is the way that we really need to study. Speaking of Ad Reinhardt, S. Newton asked on YouTube, it looked like you started on a commercially stretched and primed canvas. I'm interested in the matte, no brushstroke finish, and I'm wondering if there's more to the prep of the canvas than shown here. Can you tell me? Yes and no. As a matter of fact, I did work on a commercially primed canvas that day. Reinhardt did that occasionally, but in fact, most of the time, Reinhardt sized, stretched, and primed his canvas himself. His daughter actually told me she remembers the smell of boiling rabbit skin glue. I think she helped him cook that sometimes in the studio. So he worked with very traditional size layer before applying usually an oil ground to his paintings. In my experiments working with Reinhardt type finishes, the ground is not that important to the finish. It's really specifically how you handle that paint. I've been able to get a pretty close surface to a Reinhardt painting. And for me, I think the critical issue here is really the pigment to binder ratio, drawing a lot of that linseed oil out of the paint, preserving the kind of homogeneous, even feel of that paint, but then really getting a nice light brush stroke with a lot of solvent in there, allowing that paint to settle out nicely. Don't stay on it too long or you're going to be leaving these tracks behind your brush. But here's a great example of an artist who, if you first look at his paintings, you may think, well, this is so simple, anyone can paint like that, it's just flat black. But it's a really unique type of beautiful velvet quality of paint, and it's actually very, very difficult, as I'm sure all my students on Coursera who have gotten that far in the course can attest. I think that's probably the most difficult week of all the weeks from a technical perspective in the Coursera course. Another question on Ad Reinhardt. Mr. Fancy Pants writes, respect to the artist, couldn't agree more. But was I the only one to chuckle when he said there is no black in this painting and then proceeds to add black to the paint? Oh, he's talking about me. Yeah, maybe I overspoke a little bit. The key there, he's adding black pigment, sure, but in the finished work, you're actually not looking at any blacks. You're looking at really deep shades of other colors like red and green and blue. Of course, to get those deep shades, you're adding a lot of, in this case, Mars black paint there. So I guess you are right to chuckle. I probably should have been a little bit more clear about that. Coursera student Konstantina Iocati asks, what would you use to prime, for example, wood or metal materials other than canvas? Really good question. Well, wood, this is a pretty time-tested answer since, of course, in the Northern and Southern Renaissance, we have many painters working on panels, oak and hardwoods in the north, poplar and softwoods in the south. Gesso is the great material to prime wood. Traditional gesso is rabbit skin glue with gypsum or chalk, calcium sulfate, something like that mixed in. That works great, always has, always will. You can also work with an acrylic gesso on wood, no problem at all. If you're working on metal, this is a little bit trickier since a lot of paints and painting materials don't adhere particularly well to metal. So the first step is you probably want to etch that metal with acid. Okay, and I'm not sure if you're going to be working with that in your studio. Or you can really abrade the surface with a metal scouring pad or something like that. The point here is that if metal is really slick, it doesn't have any tooth for a paint to really bind onto. So by physically roughening up the surface, that's definitely a good idea, working in your advantage. And then what kind of primers would you work on that? I might steer you towards a commercial primer for metal now. There's a specific acrylic resin called B67, don't worry about it, or actually B48N. Regardless, certain acrylic resins are formulated to adhere to metal better. Don't go out and buy that resin necessarily, but you can find commercial products, often spray things or brush things like Rust-Oleum products, which are made for adhering to metal, and then that primer is well built for receiving other paints, like traditional acrylic emulsion paints, enamel paints, or even oil paints. Live question on the Q&A from Rachel Grodsky. Rachel says, it seems like the painters either landed in action painting or not. Why didn't they mix action with other styles, or are there such examples? There are, in fact, other examples, but the landed in action painting part, I like that. It does seem like it happened all rather quickly, and part of the reason, if we can open up the historic lens here for a moment, is that many of these painters working in New York City, and elsewhere by the way, but many of them in New York City, were really trying to find a new style. They were working very much in the shadow of European surrealism and cubism and constructivism, all of these styles from the old world, and they were really trying to break out and find something new. And it's not that one artist did that, but Pollock and de Kooning are most often credited with making the breakthrough, which was really a synthetic one, drawing upon European precedent for sure, drawing on Mexican muralists, David Alfaro Siqueiros, who had an experimental art workshop here in Lower Manhattan, but then really using the body, and the body in a big, gestural, athletic, dancer-like kind of way was a new idea, a non-European idea, and once that idea became in the air, so to speak, a lot of artists were really quick to pick it up because this became a real New York style, a real American style, something really new and exciting. Part two of that question, are there mixes with other styles? Yeah, sure. Arshil Gorky, interesting artist who unfortunately ended his own life in 1948, way too early, was working with modest kind of gestural kind of paint, but also thinking very much about surrealism and biomorphic abstraction. Biomorphic, this word, it means shapes found in nature, so looking at plants really closely, painting things that are abstract but look kind of like leaves or look kind of like a paramecium or an amoeba or something like that, but doing so in a gestural, physical kind of painterly manner. Question on Mark Rothko from Mike Dutch. I was hoping for some tips and insights on how to adopt Rothko's oil techniques into acrylic paint. Any advice from you more veteran painters would be appreciated. I'm absolutely loving the courses. Thanks. Thanks, Mike. Well, actually, Rothko himself was looking for those same insights. Rothko, towards the end of his life, he passed away in 1970. The last, I'm not exactly sure, 4 or 5 years, something like that, of his career, he worked extensively with acrylics, a more minimal approach than the more painterly things early in his career. But certainly I've had students working in Rothko style in acrylic emulsions to have really, really good results. The difference is to get those stains, you're no longer cutting oils with turpentine or mineral spirits, but you're cutting your acrylic emulsion paints, your Liquitexes or what have you, golden paints, with water. And that water is then going to allow you to have kind of a liquid Kool-Aid consistency of your paint, which you can stain and really scrub into the canvas. Now the big difference here between using water to cut your paint versus the organic spirits is surface tension. So turpentine is going to really flow nicely and evenly into your support, whereas water, as you know, if you drip some water on the table, it beads up. It has surface tension to it. So you might need to be a little bit more aggressive, brushing that, forcing it down into the canvas or into the underlying paint layer, because otherwise it may bead up and have a little bit of a resist effect. But certainly by spending a little bit more time and energy on some vigorous brushwork, you can absolutely get some extremely Rothko-like effects with those thinned out acrylic emulsions. Question from Mary Cooper. Questions about protecting acrylic and oil paintings once they're finished. I've seen various sprays advertised in art supplies catalogs for protecting finished pieces against ultraviolet light, etc. What would be the recommended way to protect paintings to make them last longer? And are there any products to be aware of that alter color over time, etc.? This is actually a huge question, and we're just going to scratch the surface, if you'll forgive the pun, here. For many, many years, there has been this kind of misconception that varnishes protect a painting. And some of you are probably saying, oh, my professor in such and such art school said exactly that. Very rarely does a varnish actually protect anything. As a matter of fact, varnishes have damaged more paintings, or the restorer trying to get that varnish off has damaged many more paintings than varnishes actually protected, I promise. So, varnishes are really an aesthetic choice here, 99%. A frame, a sheet of plexi or glass over your, now we're talking about protecting your painting really. But a varnish, every varnish is going to change color over time. If you're working with a natural resin like Damar or Damar or mastic varnish, these turn yellow gradually, and 25 years down the road, you're probably going to want to take that off and put a new one on. That's a tricky job for certain paintings, definitely a job for a conservator. If you're working with one of these newer synthetic resin varnishes, acrylics and whatnot, many of these don't turn yellow, but they kind of gray out or become foggy or milky looking over time. And again, 20, 25, 30 years down the road, you probably want to take that off and put another one on. This whole taking off and putting it on part, this is tricky. And for certain kind of paintings, it's impossible to do safely. So my own advice here, if you're using a varnish for aesthetic purposes, by all means, run with it. If you're really thinking that it's just some necessary coat that you have to do to make a finished painting, it's really a fallacy that unfortunately continues to be spread today. So I'd really skip it if the look of a varnish is not something you're interested in. Next one comes from Eva Brenda Rodriguez Paredes on Coursera. How can a contemporary painter part from post-war abstractionism into something that reflects his own identity rather than just a derivative approach from the artist we are currently analyzing? The $25,000 question. That's up to you, really. But I really don't think, especially developing artists, should worry about working in the styles of other artists. Because in doing that, invariably you're not going to make a copy. You're not going to make a Rothko that looks just like Rothko, or even a Pollock, or what have you. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to find out how your own hand does things differently. And before you start saying, oh, it's not as good as a Rothko, just realize it's different than a Rothko. And some things you may have inadvertently done are more you than Rothko, and actually these are going to find some, they're going to provide some creative pathways forward. So I would suggest absolutely painting through the masters, right? So learning about the painters that you really like, learning about their materials, their approaches, their techniques, etc. Trying your hand at it, and then finding out actually it wasn't all of Rothko's approach that I liked, it was just this one facet, which is going to provide an avenue into your own work. And by the way, don't worry about working in someone else's style. Pablo Picasso had a great quote. He said, good artists borrow, great artists steal. Nice. So go ahead, be a great artist. Steal something, make it your own. And in fact, the history of painting is full of this kind of thing. So as long as you're not, lifting an image or something like that in the style of Richard Prince or Andy Warhol and copyright infringement and all of that, I really wouldn't worry about this at all. You will find your way for sure. And by the way, Arshil Gorky, who I just mentioned a few minutes ago, did exactly that as a young artist here in New York City, in New Jersey. He basically was with Picasso for a time in the same way that you might be with a boyfriend or a girlfriend or something like that. And he was with Miro for a while and with Kandinsky for a while. And he wore his influences on his sleeve. And by the time he was done with all these withs, if you will, he realized that a little of this and a little of that and a pinch of salt and a twist of lemon, and suddenly Gorky has a very original language, which is all him. The idea of finding a signature style out of nothing is kind of a ridiculous idea here in the 21st century. So there's no reason not to borrow heavily from all these great historical sources that we have. It's part of the reason we study art history, by the way. Ziggy to the Moon asks, are there any rare color pigments that are very rare or not used by artists anymore? In fact, there are many of these. There's one really rare color called Indian yellow, which I believe is distilled from the urine of cows who eat a lot of mango leaves in India. Couldn't make that up, I promise. So anyway, that's kind of rare. There are a lot of extinct paints out there. Very few artists still work with lead white because lead is somewhat toxic. It's a little bit overblown as long as you're not eating the paint or something like that. It's a problem. Now, if your walls are powdering lead white and it's getting in your food and you're breathing it, that is a problem. But there's another color, emerald green, beautiful green, Paris green it's also called, French color from the 19th century. Believe it or not, that is rat poison. And as that pigment was patented, it was patented as a beautiful green pigment and as rat poison at the same time. So, yeah, you probably don't want to be working with that and getting that all over your hands. So that one, I don't know anyone who supplies that now. You'd have to dig a little bit. But there are some out there. But certainly with some research, you'll find many more than just those two that I mentioned. Jenny Gunnarsson asks, in fact, she asked two questions. What is the difference between binder and solvent? And what is the difference? Well, let's tackle that first question first. Binder and solvent. So binder is the glue or the vehicle of a paint. It's the stuff that's already in your tube. In other words, in an oil paint, that's linseed oil. The solvent is the thinner for it. So in the world of oil paint, the typical historical solvent is turpentine. That's a tree distilled resin. It's the thing that takes your oil and really dissolves it. Okay. So if you're working with a Liquitex or a golden acrylic emulsion, your binder is in fact that acrylic resin, that synthetic resin, and your solvent, the thinner, is now just water. Okay. And secondly, what is the difference between color value, chroma, and saturation? Hope someone out there can help me out. Thanks. Couple suggestions here. There is a little video on the Coursera course, so you might take a look at that one. You might also take a look, go on to Wikipedia and check out Munsell, that's M-U-N-S-E-L-L, Munsell Color Space. You'll find a really, really nicely written site that explores Munsell color theory. Some people are really dorked out there, thanks to those guys and gals. Essentially, value is the darkness of a color. So you're looking at a color, you're looking at this painting back here, but imagine you're seeing it just in grayscale. You're in Photoshop and you turn down all the colors. So it's how dark a shade of that gray is it. Chroma is the purity of a color. In other words, you're talking about a yellow. How much other stuff besides yellow is in there? Is it a screaming brilliant yellow, high chroma, or is it kind of a muddy, ochreish, muted kind of a yellow, low chroma? And saturation. Saturation, a term that a lot of people use, but not that many people actually know what it means. Saturation is the wet appearance of a color. Asphalt street, right? In fact, it's kind of like dark gray or something like that, but when it rains, suddenly it looks black, black, black. That's the saturated color of that unsaturated dark gray of the asphalt. In fact, paintings work the same way. In fact, the aesthetic reason that most artists use a varnish is because they want to resaturate those colors, make them look wet again after they dried. So the whole saturated business is very critical to traditional painting, perspectival painting, because when you evenly saturate all those colors, suddenly you have the ability to project some illusionistic space behind the picture plane. The picture frame turns into a window frame. You can imagine looking out into the distance into a, say, Titian painting or Vermeer or something like that. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this becomes more of an issue about the surface of a painting. Picasso making some glossy marks and some matte marks, so your eye knows that, oh, these are things that are marks made on a flat surface. So a lot of different ways to handle that, but essentially, yeah, saturated means the wet version of whatever color that you're talking about. And I think maybe our last question here, which comes from Instagram, from Felix Blanzi, says, hi, thanks for your videos, very instructive. Could you talk about thin straight lines technique in acrylic or oil, thin straight lines? Okay, a couple different ways to do this. Barnett Newman made a lot of thin straight lines, some thick straight lines also, that he called zips, working with masking tape. So to do that, you could take two pieces of masking tape, leave just a thin space between them. Before you paint that space, really make sure that that masking tape is well adhered to the canvas. Otherwise, paint is going to bleed under that masking tape. But then you can use a brush or a knife and make that mark over those two pieces of tape, critically over that gap between them. Take off the two pieces of tape while the paint is wet still, that's fine. And you should be left with a very crisp line in between. Many artists use this. Pete Mondrian famously did a whole lot of this. There's a kind of characteristic look to a masked line, however, because you get a little lip of paint. I'm actually working on a Gerhard Richter painting where the whole thing is full of these lips, where there's a little thickness of paint right where that masking tape was. So if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to get that characteristic effect, well, now you got to practice a lot. There are brushes out there called lining brushes. In fact, de Kooning worked with these as a kid when he went to trade school, art school. And he, in fact, introduced that kind of brush to Arshile Gorky. And if you look at Gorky's paintings, you'll find very beautiful, black, sinuous, thin lines, not straight lines in his case, but gorgeously executed thin ones. A lining brush comes to a really nice fine point, but they have really long bristles before the ferrule of the brush so that you can hold a lot of paint. The reason that's important is you can make a long continuous line without having to reload your brush and then replace the point, which is going to give you kind of a chattering line. So yeah, making a straight line freehand, well, now you're talking about really great draftsmen and painters. So the easy way out is masking tape, but there is a caveat that it has a kind of masked look to it for sure. We do have a couple more live questions, looks like here. This one's from YouTube, from Katie Frank. Please tell us more about your personal artwork. These days, I haven't spent a whole lot of time at the easel because I spent a lot of work as a conservator and teaching. When I was making a ton of work in the studio, I made mostly abstract paintings where I didn't really work with paint per se, but chose to use other everyday materials and find ways for them to behave like paint. For example, taking iron shavings, finding a way to fuse them onto canvas, and then working with different kinds of acid to dissolve that and repatinate the surface. Or working with makeup. Makeup's something that looks a whole lot like paint actually, but it never dries. As a matter of fact, speaking of saturation or thinking about chroma, it's possible to get more chromatic or more saturated colors with silicone, the binder of a lot of makeups, than it is with oil because it stays wet. Of course, those little fingerprints get all over the place too. Anyway, maybe more on that some other time. Question from Foster Atkinson. We're just going to ignore the fact that this guy looks like Drake. I learned this from the YouTube videos. Actually, I did hear that once before. I could do worse, I guess, right? I'm more of a Kendrick Lamar guy, but I'll take that as a compliment. Thanks, Foster Atkinson. And Vita Matthew said, so Drake's a painter now. Thanks, yeah. If there's another Drake one, what do we got? Ronaldo Rodriguez says, are you Drake's lost brother? I don't know about that, but it's starting to look likely, I guess, yes. I can guess. No more on Drake. Okay, so let's wrap up here. We've had some requests for additional content, more videos, etc., coming up. In the studio videos, we've actually had a couple, more than a couple of people request a part 2 of a Willem de Kooning video. You see where I left off in part 1 behind me. And I mentioned in that video on YouTube and on Coursera that a de Kooning painting is never made in one afternoon, no way. In fact, he sometimes spent months or even years on his canvases, so this work necessarily looks really thin and fresh, whereas a real de Kooning painting is very labor intensive and very heavy. In fact, we're going to do that. I'm going to talk about a couple ways that de Kooning would move on from week to week or day to day by scraping, physically dry paint, scraping it off the canvas, and also by working temporarily or permanently with collage elements in the canvas, making a drawing, putting that drawing on the canvas, painting over it, extending some of those lines, maybe taking that drawing back off or maybe leaving it there. So absolutely stay tuned for that one. The Art Chick, nice name. Would you do a painting a la Fauve style? Love this channel, have learned so much, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Fauve, the movement means wild beast in French. That's Henri Matisse, his followers, Maurice de Vlaminck, Duran, artists like that. Fauve technique is actually quite straightforward. So this is one that I think we really should do. And this is a great kind of beginning modern painting style. Most Fauves, wild beasts, they painted wet in wet. Very direct painting technique, straight out of the tubes at times. They really admire the paintings of children, finger painting, very simple looking paintings, but there's really nothing simple about a Matisse, as we'll find out. Rosen around says, hello, as an aspiring painter living in Tokyo, I love the How to Paint Like Yayoi Kusama video. Any chance you could do a How to Paint Like Picasso in his abstract works? Or Jean-Michel Basquiat, thanks. In fact, Picasso never made an abstract painting, believe it or not, although he came pretty damn close. In fact, we are going to do this. We are going to make a Cubism video, anyway, not specifically Picasso, but also Georges Braque, who also gets left out, but was absolutely 50% of the invention of Cubism. I think this is going to be a really strong video because in making a Cubist drawing and then a painting, you're really going to understand what Cubism is all about. It's going to help you look at a Cubist painting and really appreciate Cubism, one of the really most important movements of the entire 20th century. Basquiat, interesting one also. Next one, please do one on Basquiat. Michael Agosto, Jean-Michel Basquiat, please. Okay, I get it. Basquiat, who is doing extremely well in museums and auction houses these days, really interesting artist who, like Rauschenberg, like many other artists, felt extremely free to do anything and everything with any kind of material, any kind of paint, etc. In a way, this is a hard one because there isn't one Basquiat style at all to choose from. But certainly we can look at some of the materials he painted on, some very unorthodox choices of supports. I worked on a painting recently that's stretched over a pallet, like a wooden pallet, not on a painter's pallet, but a wooden pallet for like moving furniture and things like that. Looked great on the back, almost as great as it did on the front. And we can talk about some of the enamels that he worked with and oil stick and some of the other effects that he went back to again and again. So absolutely, let's do it. Make a Gustin. We also received a lot of Gustin requests. I think that's a great idea. Philip Gustin, an artist who started out as a figurative painter, was a kind of relative latecomer to abstraction circa 1952-53 here in New York City, and then actually was one of the first New York school painters to really lose faith in abstraction and return to figuration before making some really interesting paintings in the 1970s, where he's thinking about cartoons and sarcasm and satire, etc. Gustin is one of my favorite painters. I'd love to talk about some of the continuity between his abstract works and then some of his later figurative works, which for all their crassness, their lowbrow humor, are actually really gorgeously painted more often than not. Bridget Riley, Robert Motherwell, Clifford Still, Gustav Klimt, Helen Frankenthaler, lots of really interesting artists that people are requesting here. By all means, keep requests coming, and as we start to find, more interest in certain areas than others, I will absolutely take that into consideration. Yeah, it looks like we have a Cubism video, a de Kooning video on the way. Click on subscribe down below. You'll be sure not to miss those videos when they pop up. If we didn't get to your questions in the video, we'll try answering some of them in text in the various discussion forums here on YouTube or on Coursera. And by all means, keep those questions coming as well. Also, let us know if you like this session. I'd be happy to do more of them if this kind of thing is useful or fun, if this is better than clicking away on the keyboard and getting responses in text a couple days or a week later. If there's interest, let us know. So thanks for tuning in. Keep sending questions, and thanks again for watching in the studio.